The mess hall at Forward Operating Base Greystone never truly went quiet, not even at 500 when the sky outside was still bruised purple and the coffee was still burning the bottom of the pot. There was always noise, the clatter of metal trays, the scrape of boots on concrete, the low murmur of men and women who had learned to talk without really saying anything. It was background noise, the soundtrack of survival. And somewhere inside all of it, in the far corner nearest the eastern wall, Corporal Daniel Hess sat alone, the way he always did, the way he had every single morning for the past 11 months. He wasn't hiding. That was the thing people misunderstood about Daniel. He wasn't antisocial, wasn't broken in any visible way, didn't wear his damage on the outside where others could see it and feel uncomfortable. He was simply quiet. Deliberately, purposefully, almost architecturally quiet. He had built his silence the way some men build walls, brick by brick, after learning the hard way that noise attracted attention, and attention had a way of pulling things out of a man that he wasn't ready to give. His tray sat in front of him, eggs, toast, black coffee, nothing remarkable. He ate slowly without looking up, his eyes tracing the grain of the table like it was something worth studying. Around him, the mess hall filled steadily. Soldiers moved in groups, loud and gravitational, pulling chairs and claiming territory the way soldiers always did. Nobody drifted toward the eastern corner. Not because there was anything wrong with it. The corner was perfectly fine, perfectly accessible, but because Daniel had a quality about him that was difficult to explain. He didn't repel people. He simply didn't invite them. There was a difference, and he understood it completely. He was 29 years old, 5'11", lean in the way that field medics got lean, not from the gym but from movement, from urgency, from months of carrying weight across uneven ground in conditions that didn't care about your comfort. His hands were steady in a way that surgeons spent years trying to achieve. His eyes were dark brown and unusually still, the kind of eyes that had seen enough to stop being surprised by things. The other soldiers respected him the way they respected a reliable piece of equipment, grateful when they needed him, unbothered when they didn't. That Tuesday morning felt identical to every other Tuesday morning, until it didn't. The shift happened at 6:32, which Daniel would later remember precisely because he had just checked his watch. A different kind of energy moved through the mess hall, not panic, not alarm, but the particular static that preceded the arrival of someone important. Conversations dropped half a volume. Postures straightened without anyone consciously deciding to straighten them. A sergeant near the door actually tucked in his shirt. These were involuntary reactions, biological responses to rank, and they rippled through the room like a stone dropped in still water. Major General Cole Whitmore walked through the doors of the mess hall like a man who had never once in his life questioned whether he belonged somewhere. He was tall, 6'2", maybe 6'3", with silver threading through close-cropped dark hair and the kind of physical presence that didn't require a uniform to command a room, though the uniform certainly didn't hurt. 4 stars. A chest full of ribbons that told stories most people would never be cleared to hear. His face was angular and weathered, not unkind, but carrying the particular gravity of a man who had made decisions that cost lives, and had learned to live inside that weight without letting it crush him. Every table in the mess hall performed a silent, desperate pantomime. Soldiers shifted. Spaces appeared. Eyes darted toward the general with expressions caught somewhere between reverence and anxiety. Several officers actively gestured, subtle waves, adjusted chairs, the body language equivalent of "over here, sir, plenty of room, we've been waiting." Whitmore ignored all of it. His eyes moved across the room once, practiced, efficient, the scan of a man trained to assess environments in seconds. They traveled past the crowded center tables, past the officers near the windows, past the sergeant who had tucked in his shirt and was now regretting every life choice that had led to this moment. They stopped at the eastern corner. At the thin, quiet man eating eggs alone like the rest of the world was optional. Whitmore moved. directly, without hesitation, cutting a clean line through the mess hall while every eye in the room tracked him in disbelief. He stopped at Daniel's table, pulled out the chair across from him with one hand, and stood there for a brief moment, not hovering, not performing, just pausing the way a man does when he's made a decision, and is giving it one final beat of consideration. Then he asked, in a voice that was quieter than anyone expected from a man of his size and rank, "Can I sit here?" The mess hall didn't breathe. Daniel Hess looked up from his eggs. He took in the 4 stars, the ribbons, the general's measured expression, and registered none of it with anything resembling alarm. He simply looked at the man the way he looked at most things, directly, calmly, without performance. "It's a free country, sir," he said, and looked back down at his tray. Whitmore sat down. And in the stunned, electric silence that followed, forks frozen, coffee cups suspended, 37 soldiers collectively forgetting how to function, nobody noticed the Belgian Malinois moving quietly around the table. Nobody saw Rex lower himself to the ground. Nobody caught the exact moment that the most battle-hardened military dog on the base chose a quiet medic's feet as the only place in the room worth lying down. They only noticed the silence after it happened. And by then, everything had already changed. Nobody in Fob Greystone had ever seen Rex choose anyone. That was the thing that made it so disorienting, not just the act itself, but the history behind it. Rex was not a pet. He was not a mascot. He was not the kind of military working dog that soldiers sneaked treats to behind the handler's back and photographed for care packages home. Rex was a weapon with a heartbeat, 4 years of combat deployment, 2 confirmed building clearances, 1 extraction mission that had gone sideways in ways that were still classified, and a temperament that his official handler, Sergeant First Class Ortega, described in every quarterly report with the same 3 words: reliable, focused, indifferent. Indifferent to strangers, indifferent to noise, indifferent to the kind of human attention that most dogs craved like oxygen. Rex tolerated affection from Ortega because Ortega had earned it, slowly, carefully, over 18 months of consistent work and mutual respect. Everyone else existed to Rex as either a threat, a neutral presence, or background information. He processed humans the way a security camera processed movement, registering without caring. Which was why, when Rex walked around the table and lay down at Daniel Hess's feet, the mess hall didn't just go quiet. It went wrong quiet. The kind of quiet that made people put down their forks and look around, checking whether they had missed something, an alarm, a signal, some piece of information that explained what their eyes were currently telling them. Ortega, sitting 3 tables away with 2 other handlers, saw it first. He blinked, looked down at his tray, looked back up. Rex had not moved. The dog was lying flat, chin nearly touching the floor, eyes half-lidded in a posture that Ortega had only ever seen Rex adopt in 2 contexts: exhaustion after a long operation or complete and total peace. Neither made sense right now. They were in a mess hall, at breakfast, in front of a 4-star general. And Rex had decided, without consultation or command, that the correct place to be was at the feet of a corporal who hadn't even acknowledged him. A lieutenant near the window actually stood halfway out of his chair to see better, then caught himself and sat back down, trying to look like he hadn't just done that. General Whitmore noticed the shift in the room before he looked down. He had spent decades reading environments, reading people, reading the invisible language that moved through groups of soldiers when something unexpected happened. He felt the change in atmospheric pressure. The collective held breath and followed it downward. Rex was at Daniel's feet. Whitmore stared at his dog for a long moment. His expression didn't break. Generals learned early that their faces were public property, that every reaction was watched and catalogued by everyone in the room. But something moved through his eyes. Something private and careful, the way a man looks when a familiar thing suddenly behaves in a way he cannot explain and cannot dismiss. He looked back up at Daniel. Daniel had noticed Rex approximately 4 seconds after the dog settled. He hadn't startled, hadn't pulled his feet back or leaned away. He had simply looked down, taken in the animal with the same quiet directness he applied to everything, and then done something that made Ortega's jaw go slack from 3 tables away. He reached down slowly, no sudden movement, no performance, and placed 2 fingers gently on the top of Rex's broad head. Just briefly. Just a single, unhurried touch, the kind that communicated "I see you" without demanding anything in return. Rex's tail moved once, a single, slow sweep against the concrete floor. Ortega had owned Rex for 18 months. He had never once seen that tail move for a stranger. "He doesn't usually do that," Whitmore said. His voice was measured, but the words came out with a weight that suggested they were an understatement of considerable proportions. Daniel glanced up briefly, then back at his coffee. "Animals are honest," he said simply. "They don't perform." Whitmore was quiet for a moment. He looked at Daniel with the expression of a man encountering a language he hadn't expected to recognize, familiar syllables in an unfamiliar mouth. "No," the general said slowly, "they don't." Around them, the mess hall was beginning to remember how to function. Forks moved again. Conversations restarted in low murmurs. The machinery of breakfast resumed. But the energy had fundamentally shifted, like a room after lightning. Everything looked the same. Nothing felt identical. Soldiers ate their food and talked about nothing and kept stealing glances at the eastern corner where a general and a medic sat in comfortable silence, and a combat dog refused to move from his chosen post. By the time Whitmore finished his coffee, Rex had not stirred once. Not when a tray clattered loudly nearby. Not when 2 soldiers argued over a chair 3 feet away. Not when Ortega walked over, crouched down, and said his name in the firm, quiet tone that always brought the dog to attention. Rex opened one eye, looked at Ortega with an expression that somehow managed to communicate "I am busy," and closed it again. Ortega stood up slowly. He looked at Daniel, who was finishing his toast and apparently unbothered by all of it. Then he looked at General Whitmore, who gave him the smallest, most imperceptible shake of his head. "Leave it." Ortega walked back to his table and sat down. He picked up his fork, stared at his food, and said quietly to the handler beside him, "In 4 years, that dog has never done that." The other handler watched Rex's tail make one more slow, contented sweep across the floor. "Maybe," he said carefully, "he knows something we don't." Whitmore heard this. His hearing, like most things about him, was sharper than people assumed. He didn't respond. He simply set down his empty cup, looked once more at the quiet medic across from him, and made a decision that he wouldn't fully understand until much later. He was going to find out exactly who Corporal Daniel Hess was, and why the most honest creature on the base had chosen him, without hesitation, without command, as the only person worth lying down for. General Whitmore did not make a habit of curiosity. Curiosity, in his experience, was a luxury, something junior officers indulged in when they had time to spare and stakes low enough to absorb the consequences of being wrong. At his level, questions were tools, not impulses. You asked them deliberately, aimed them carefully, and always knew in advance what you were willing to do with the answer. He had operated this way for over 2 decades, and it had served him well. But that evening, sitting alone in the base commander's borrowed office with a single manila folder on the desk in front of him, Whitmore found himself doing something uncomfortably close to being simply curious. The folder was thin, thinner than it should have been for a soldier 11 months into a forward deployment with a combat support role. He opened it with the same methodical calm he brought to everything, smoothing the edges flat with one hand the way a man does when he is preparing himself to read something carefully. The first page was standard: enlistment date, basic training scores, MOS classification, assignment history. Nothing remarkable on the surface. Daniel Hess had scored in the 91st percentile on his medical aptitude evaluation. His field training assessments were marked exceptional across 3 consecutive reviews. His commanding officer at his previous posting had written in the final evaluation box, "Corporal Hess operates with a level of composure under pressure that most soldiers twice his age have not achieved." A strong sentence, the kind that should have launched a file full of follow-up documentation. It hadn't. Whitmore turned the page, then the next, his reading slowed. There were references, 3 of them in different sections, to a specific field incident approximately 18 months prior. Each reference used almost identical language. See attached incident report for full detail. Whitmore looked for the attached incident report. It wasn't there. Not missing in the sense of being misplaced, missing in the way that suggested it had either never been properly filed or had been deliberately set aside before it could become part of the permanent record. There were commendation forms. 2 of them, both partially completed, both unsigned at the authorization level. Someone had started the paperwork. Someone had stopped before finishing it. The reason was not documented anywhere. Whitmore closed the folder and sat back in his chair. He had read enough service files over the years to understand their grammar, the way they spoke, what their silences meant, where the gaps were intentional and where they were simply bureaucratic noise. This file had the specific texture of a story someone had decided not to tell. Not out of malice necessarily, but out of the particular institutional laziness that allowed quiet soldiers to remain quiet indefinitely. Because quiet soldiers didn't demand anything, didn't create problems, didn't require anyone to sit down and do the uncomfortable work of acknowledging what they had done. The next morning, Whitmore began asking questions. He was careful about it. He didn't call formal meetings or pull people into offices. He asked the way experienced commanders asked, sideways, casually, in the margins of other conversations. During a walkthrough of the medical bay, he mentioned Hess to the senior medical officer. "Good medic, steady hands, keeps to himself," offered with a shrug, as though Daniel were a piece of furniture that functioned adequately. In the motor pool, he asked a sergeant about unit cohesion, let the conversation drift naturally toward individual soldiers, and waited. Most people gave him versions of the same answer, assembled from the same limited vocabulary. Quiet, reliable, professional, private. Nobody gave him a story. Until Sergeant First Class Raymond Briggs. Briggs was the kind of soldier that every forward operating base quietly depended on and rarely formally recognized. 50s, broad through the shoulders, a face that looked like it had been used hard and put away without enough care. He had been at Greystone for 14 months. He had seen things. He had the eyes that came with that. Whitmore found him behind the motor pool, running a maintenance check on a vehicle that didn't particularly need one. Briggs looked up, registered the 4 stars, and straightened without making a production of it. "Walk with me," Whitmore said. They walked in silence for 30 seconds. Then Whitmore asked without preamble, "Tell me about Hess." Briggs was quiet for long enough that Whitmore thought he might deflect, give him the furniture answer, the reliable and private combination that everyone else had offered. But Briggs stopped walking. He looked out across the compound toward nothing in particular, jaw working slightly, the way a man does when he is deciding how much truth the moment requires. "Sir," he said finally, his voice dropped low despite the absence of anyone nearby, "that man ran into a collapsing structure 4 separate times in complete darkness with a dead radio and no backup." He paused, brought out 4 soldiers, one at a time, on his knees through rubble. Whitmore said nothing. He waited. The 4th one, Private Webb, was gone before first light. Nothing anyone could have done by that point. The damage was too far along. Briggs turned and looked directly at the general for the first time. Hess held him until he passed. Then he stood up, repacked his kit, and walked back to base. Another pause. Next morning he was in the mess hall, same corner, same time, eating eggs like it was any other day. "And the recognition?" Whitmore asked quietly. Briggs almost smiled, not warmly, but with the particular expression of a man who had asked himself the same question many times. "He said it wasn't worth the paperwork, sir. Said the men who made it home were the story. Said Webb deserved the write-up, not him." Whitmore stood very still. "Nobody pushed it." "Nobody pushed it," Briggs confirmed, "because he didn't ask anyone to." Whitmore thanked him with a nod and walked back toward the command building alone. He moved at his normal pace, measured, deliberate, because generals did not let their posture tell their feelings to the people watching. But inside, something was shifting. He sat back down at the borrowed desk. He opened the thin folder one more time and looked at the incomplete commendation forms, the missing incident report, the gap where a story should have been. Then he picked up a pen, and he began to write the file that someone else should have written 18 months ago. There are nights that don't end. Not in the literal sense. The sun still rises, the clock still moves, the world continues its indifferent rotation regardless of what happened in the dark. But certain nights leave a mark so deep, so permanently woven into the architecture of a person, that they never truly conclude. They simply relocate from the external world into the internal one, where they replay on a loop that no amount of daylight can fully interrupt. For Corporal Daniel Hess, that night was October 14th. It had begun as a support assignment, straightforward by the standards of forward deployment, which meant it was only moderately dangerous rather than actively catastrophic. Daniel's unit was providing medical overwatch for a building clearance operation in a dense urban corridor, approximately 6 kilometers from Fob Greystone. The structure in question was a 3-story concrete building that intelligence had flagged as a potential weapons cache. The clearance team went in at 2200 hours. Daniel positioned himself at the staging point outside with his kit organized, his radio on, and the particular focused calm he had trained himself to maintain in the minutes before things either went smoothly or didn't. At 2247, the building came down. Not all at once. It wasn't a clean collapse, wasn't the kind of dramatic implosion that looked almost cinematic from a distance. It was a progressive failure, the second floor giving way first under weight it had never been designed to carry, pulling the third floor down after it in a grinding, cascading roar that lasted approximately 4 seconds and produced a cloud of concrete dust so thick it turned Daniel's headlamp into a useless white smear. The radio went dead 9 seconds later. Daniel stood at the edge of the debris field and did the calculation that he would never speak aloud to anyone, the one that every first responder runs in the first 30 seconds of a mass casualty event, the brutal arithmetic of survival probability versus resource availability. He had one trauma kit, one headlamp, no backup, no communication, 4 soldiers unaccounted for somewhere inside a collapsed structure in complete darkness. He went in. The first soldier, Specialist Carver, 24, from Ohio, was closest to the outer wall and therefore the luckiest. Fractured left arm, laceration above the eye, conscious and coherent enough to tell Daniel where the others had been when the floor gave. Daniel stabilized him, marked his position with a chem light from his kit, and moved deeper. The second extraction took longer. Private Domings was pinned beneath a section of collapsed ceiling, not trapped beyond recovery, but requiring the kind of careful, systematic work that turned minutes into eternities when you were doing it alone in the dark. Daniel talked to her the entire time. Not encouragement exactly, something quieter than that, something more honest. "I've got you. Stay with me. Don't go anywhere I can't follow." It took 22 minutes. She was unconscious by the time he moved her but breathing steadily. He marked her position and kept going. The third soldier, Sergeant Torres, had found a pocket of survivable space near a load-bearing wall and was functional enough to help himself once Daniel reached him. They moved together back toward the outer edge. Daniel handed Torres off, turned around, and went back in for the 4th time. Private First Class Marcus Webb was 19 years old. He was from a small town in rural Tennessee, whose name Daniel would later look up on a map and stare at for longer than he could explain. He had joined the army 11 months ago. He kept a photograph in his breast pocket, a golden retriever named Biscuit, sitting in tall summer grass, mouth open in the particular joyful way that dogs had of making even ordinary moments look like the best day of their life. Daniel found him in the deepest part of the collapse, in a space barely large enough for two men, already in the tertiary stage of hemorrhagic shock. He worked without stopping, without panic, without the luxury of feeling anything that would slow his hands: tourniquet, chest seal, pressure, airway management. He ran through his entire kit with the systematic precision of a man who had trained for this scenario hundreds of times, and was now discovering, in the most devastating possible way, the difference between training and reality. The difference was Marcus Webb's breathing, the way it changed, gradually, imperceptibly at first, then undeniably. The way it became something other than breathing. The way it became, around 4:43, simply stillness. Daniel sat back on his heels in the rubble and darkness and stayed there for a moment that had no measured length. He did not cry, not because he didn't feel it, but because the feeling was so enormous, so structurally total, that it existed somewhere beyond the reach of tears. It was the kind of grief that didn't express itself immediately. It went inward instead, found the deepest available space, and settled there permanently, the way water finds the lowest point in any terrain and stays. He reached into Marcus's breast pocket and took out the photograph of Biscuit. He held it for a moment in the beam of his headlamp, the golden dog in the summer grass, frozen in a joy that had no knowledge of what came next. Then he placed it back, carefully, exactly where it had been. He repacked his kit in the dark, methodically, completely, every pouch closed and secured the way he'd been trained, because discipline was the last thing standing when everything else collapsed. He marked Marcus's position with his final chem light. He stood up. He walked back to base. He showered. He slept for 3 hours, or lay in the dark for 3 hours, which from the outside looked identical. At 5:30 he was in the mess hall. Same corner, same seat, same black coffee and eggs that he ate slowly without looking up, while around him the base hummed with its ordinary noise, completely unaware that the quiet man in the corner had spent the night in a collapsed building doing the most important and most invisible work of his life. He never filed for recognition. When his commanding officer asked him to submit a formal account for the record, Daniel had looked up from his desk with those dark, still eyes and said simply, "The 3 that made it home are the record, sir. Webb deserves a write-up, not me." And because Daniel didn't push, nobody pushed back. The night of October 14th went officially unfinished, incomplete forms, missing reports, a gap in the record where a story should have lived. But in Daniel Hess, it never ended. It simply moved inside, where it had been living ever since, quiet and permanent and heavy, in the corner of him that he kept farthest from the door. There is a particular kind of loneliness that only soldiers understand. It is not the loneliness of isolation, not the simple absence of people or conversation or human contact. It is something more specific and more permanent than that. It is the loneliness of carrying something that cannot be explained to anyone who wasn't there, in a world that has moved on from the moment that made you who you are, surrounded by people who care about you and cannot reach you at the same time. It is the loneliness of being present in every room you enter and unreachable in all of them. Both Daniel Hess and General Cole Whitmore knew this loneliness intimately. They had simply never met anyone else who did, not in the way that mattered, not in the way that could be felt across a table, without either man having to explain it. By the 4th morning, Whitmore had stopped pretending. He arrived at the mess hall at 5:40, earlier than the crowd, earlier than the noise, carrying 2 cups of black coffee with the straightforward confidence of a man who had made a decision and saw no reason to be indirect about it. He set 1 cup in front of Daniel's tray without ceremony, pulled out the chair across from him, and sat down. Daniel looked at the coffee, then at the general, Then back at his eggs. He said nothing, but he didn't move the cup away. They ate in silence for several minutes, a silence that had changed texture since the first morning. It was no longer the silence of two strangers tolerating proximity. It had become something more deliberate, more mutual. The silence of two people who had independently decided that the other one was worth sitting near, even without words to justify it. Rex was already at Daniel's feet, before Whitmore had finished settling into his chair. It was Whitmore who spoke first, which surprised them both. He didn't announce it, didn't preface it with rank or authority or the careful diplomatic language that generals used when they were managing a conversation rather than participating in one. He simply set down his coffee cup, looked at a point somewhere between the table and the middle distance, and began talking in the quiet, level voice of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had finally found a surface strong enough to set it down on. He told Daniel about Operation Nightfall. Not the official version, not the sanitized debriefing language that had made it into reports and eventually into a commendation ceremony at the Pentagon. The real version. The version that lived in him at 3 in the morning when the darkness was total and the silence was absolute, and the faces came back regardless of how many years had passed or how many promotions had followed. 6 men. A coastal extraction mission in conditions that had been rated acceptable and had proven catastrophically otherwise. Communications compromised within the first 8 minutes. Extraction route blocked. 6 men making decisions in real time with incomplete information and no margin for error. Whitmore had been the team leader. He had made the calls, the right calls, by every technical and tactical measure, the kind of calls that the debriefers later confirmed were correct given the available intelligence. The calls that still resulted in 5 men not coming home. He was the sole survivor by a combination of factors that he had spent 7 years trying to assign meaning to and had never once succeeded. Position, timing, the specific geometry of a situation that had no logic and no lesson and no comfort available in it. He had simply lived when the others hadn't, and no amount of tactical analysis had ever produced a satisfying explanation for why. "They gave me a silver star," he said, his voice entirely even. "Full ceremony, Pentagon. The secretary shook my hand, said I was an example of everything the Navy stood for." He paused, picked up his coffee, set it back down without drinking. "I stood at that podium and gave a speech about sacrifice and courage and the honor of service." Another pause, longer this time. "I meant every word, and I haven't slept a full night since." The mess hall moved around them, trays clattering, conversations running, the ordinary machinery of a military morning. And none of it touched the eastern corner where 2 men sat inside a silence that had its own specific gravity. Daniel was quiet for a long moment after Whitmore finished. He didn't offer condolences, didn't reach for the comfortable language that people used when they didn't know what else to do with someone else's pain. He understood, instinctively, that Whitmore hadn't told him this story because he wanted comfort. He had told it because he wanted to be heard by someone who would understand what was actually being said, not the words, but the weight underneath them. "Marcus Webb," Daniel said finally. His voice was low and completely steady. 19 years old, rural Tennessee. He had a dog named Biscuit. He looked at his coffee cup. Golden retriever, fat and happy in the photo. The kind of dog that makes you believe the world is fundamentally okay. He didn't say anything else. He didn't explain the context or describe October 14th or tell Whitmore what had happened in that collapsed building. He didn't need to. The name and the dog and the particular way he said 19 years old, the weight that lived inside those 3 words, communicated everything that mattered. Whitmore nodded slowly, the nod of a man receiving information he already understood in his bones. "The medals," Daniel said quietly, almost to himself, "don't fill the silence." Whitmore looked up sharply. Those were his own words, the exact words he had said to himself, privately, in the dark of borrowed quarters across a dozen different postings over 7 years. He had never said them aloud to anyone, not his commanding officers, not the chaplain, not the military psychologist he had seen twice and then stopped seeing because the sessions felt like performing grief rather than processing it. He stared at Daniel. "No," he said after a moment, "they don't." Rex shifted at Daniel's feet, not restlessly, but with the slow, deliberate movement of an animal resettling into deeper comfort, the way dogs did when they had decided a place was safe enough to fully relax into. His chin dropped completely to the floor. His breathing slowed and deepened. Neither man spoke for several minutes after that. They didn't need to. Something had passed between them that existed entirely outside the architecture of rank and protocol and the careful management of military relationships. Something older and more fundamental, the recognition between two people who had each spent years believing that what they carried was uniquely and permanently isolating, and who were now sitting across a table from evidence that it wasn't. It didn't fix anything. Daniel understood that. Whitmore understood it too. The names didn't change. Marcus Webb was still gone. The 5 men from Operation Nightfall were still gone. Grief didn't negotiate with company, it simply became, in certain moments, slightly less total. Slightly less silent. The mess hall noise continued around them. Rex breathed slowly at Daniel's feet. 2 cups of black coffee cooled on a table in the eastern corner of Fob Greystone, and 2 soldiers sat together inside the specific, irreducible loneliness of their profession, and found, for the first time in a very long time, that they were not entirely alone inside it. It wasn't healing, but it was the first condition necessary for it. And sometimes that was everything. Word traveled the way it always traveled on a forward operating base. Not through official channels, not through briefings or bulletins or any of the formal mechanisms that military institutions maintain the polite fiction of relying upon. It traveled the way water traveled, finding the smallest available crack, moving through it, spreading outward in ways that were impossible to predict and equally impossible to stop. By the end of Day 4 of General Whitmore's visit, every soldier on Fob Greystone knew that the 4-star SEAL commander was spending his mornings in the eastern corner of the mess hall with Corporal Daniel Hess. The interpretations were as varied as the people generating them. The junior enlisted soldiers, the ones closest to Daniel's rank, the ones who had eaten near him for months without ever really seeing him, landed predominantly on the investigation theory. It had the internal logic that rumors required to sustain themselves. A general showing up unannounced, spending concentrated time with a low-ranking soldier, asking questions around the base. It assembled itself into a narrative of scrutiny almost automatically. By the second day of speculation, the story had evolved to include a classified incident, a potential court-martial, and in the most ambitious version, circulated by a private who had an exceptional talent for creative embellishment, a connection to an international intelligence operation that had gone wrong somewhere in Eastern Europe. None of it had any basis in reality. All of it spread with tremendous enthusiasm. The officer class interpreted things differently. Among the lieutenants and captains who occupied the middle tier of Fob Greystone's hierarchy, the dominant theory was recruitment, that Whitmore had identified something in Hess during the initial mess hall encounter and was now conducting an informal assessment for some specialized role. This theory had the advantage of being plausible enough to feel credible and vague enough to resist disapproval. It also had the advantage of being considerably more interesting than the truth, which was simply 2 men finding in each other something they hadn't known they were looking for. It was Lieutenant Ferris who turned interpretation into action. Ferris was 27, ambitious in the specific way that revealed itself most clearly under pressure, not the clean ambition of genuine excellence, but the anxious, opportunistic kind that was always scanning the environment for advancement angles. He was not a bad officer in any fundamental sense. He was simply a young man who had learned early that proximity to important people was its own form of currency, and who had not yet learned the more important lesson about the difference between proximity and worth. He saw the general's interest in Hess as an opportunity. If Whitmore valued the medic, then presenting the medic more favorably, more visibly, more prominently, would reflect well on Ferris as the officer who had facilitated the improvement. The logic was thin but internally consistent, which was enough for Ferris to act on it. He went to the base medical coordinator on the afternoon of day 4 and quietly arranged for Daniel to be reassigned, temporarily, he specified, just for the duration of the general's visit to the primary medical station near the command building. More central, more visible, the kind of posting that put a soldier in the line of sight of people who mattered. He felt good about this decision for approximately 40 minutes. Whitmore found out through his aide, who had heard it from the medical coordinator, who had immediately regretted agreeing to the arrangement the moment the words were out of her mouth. The general received the information during a logistics briefing, registered it with no visible reaction, excused himself politely from the meeting, and walked to Ferris's office. He knocked once, entered without waiting for a response, closed the door behind him with a quietness that was considerably more alarming than slamming it would have been. Ferris stood immediately. His instincts, at least, were correctly calibrated. Whitmore looked at him for a moment without speaking, the particular look of a man taking the full measure of a situation, before deciding how much of his actual response to deploy. Then he spoke in the calm, unhurried voice that people who had served under him knew to be significantly more serious than shouting. "Lieutenant," he said, "what was the reasoning behind reassigning Corporal Hess?" Ferris opened his mouth. Something about visibility and optimal resource positioning came out, the words of a man trying to dress a bad decision in professional language, while actively watching that strategy fail in real time. Whitmore let him finish. Then he said, with the precise economy of a man who had learned that 4 words could accomplish what 4 paragraphs couldn't, "Don't touch that assignment." He held Ferris's gaze for exactly long enough to ensure the message had been received at a cellular level. Then he turned, opened the door, and left. The door closed behind him with the same quiet precision as before. Ferris sat back down in his chair and remained there for some time, staring at his desk, rearranging his understanding of several things simultaneously. The reassignment was reversed within the hour. Meanwhile, a separate and entirely unrelated situation was developing in the K-9 unit that was generating its own bureaucratic confusion. Rex had stopped sleeping in the K-9 quarters. It had begun on night 2 of Whitmore's visit. Ortega had done the final check at 2100, confirmed Rex was settled, and gone to his own bunk. At 5:30 the next morning, Rex was not in the K-9 unit. He was found outside Daniel's quarters, lying against the base of the door with the settled, purposeful stillness of an animal that had made a considered decision, and had no interest in explaining it to anyone. Ortega had brought him back without incident. Rex had gone cooperatively, without resistance, displaying the complete behavioral compliance that made him an exemplary working dog. And then, the following night, he had left again. Same time, same destination, same settled posture against Daniel's door when Ortega found him at first light. By the 3rd occurrence, Ortega had filed a formal report. Then a second. Then a third, increasingly baffled report that he submitted more out of procedural obligation than any belief that paperwork would resolve whatever was happening. The reports traveled up the chain to the base commander, Colonel Marsh, who read all 3 of them on a Thursday evening with a cup of tea going cold on his desk. He read them once, then again. Then he set them down, looked out the window at the compound for a long moment, and picked up his pen. In the margin of the 3rd report, in his precise, unhurried handwriting, he wrote 7 words. "The dog knows something we don't. Leave it." He filed the reports in a drawer, finished his tea, and went to bed. Rex was found outside Daniel's door again the following morning. Nobody moved him. And in the eastern corner of the mess hall, as the base continued to watch and whisper and construct elaborate theories about what was happening between a general and a medic and a dog that had chosen sides without being asked, the truth remained exactly what it had always been. Simple, quiet, entirely invisible to anyone who was looking too hard to see it. 2 men, 1 table, a dog who knew before anyone else did that something worth protecting was sitting in the corner of that room, and had decided, with the uncomplicated certainty that only honest creatures possessed, that his job was to stay close until the rest of the world figured it out. The announcement came through standard channels. Full formation, 700, dress uniform where applicable, attendance mandatory across all active personnel not engaged in essential operational duties. The notice was clipped, administrative, entirely unremarkable, the kind of bulletin that moved through a base without generating particular interest because it resembled every other formation bulletin that had ever preceded it. Inspection review, the announcement specified. Routine assessment of unit readiness, in conjunction with the visiting command delegation. Soldiers grumbled the way soldiers always grumbled about mandatory formations, quietly among themselves, with the practiced resignation of people who had long ago made peace with the fact that large portions of military life consisted of standing in straight lines while important people looked at you. They pressed uniforms. They polished boots. They filed out into the pale morning air of Fob Greystone and arranged themselves into ranks with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this particular thing more times than they could count. Daniel Hess stood in the 3rd row, 4th from the left. He had dressed without particular thought, pressed his uniform with the same automatic care he applied to everything, attended to his boots, arrived at the formation point at 6:50 with 10 minutes to spare because arriving early was simply what he did. He stood in his position and looked straight ahead at the middle distance the way soldiers were trained to stand, and he thought about nothing in particular, which was the specific mental discipline of a man who had learned to keep his inner world quiet during the spaces between moments that required it to be active. He had no reason to expect anything. General Whitmore took the platform at 7:03. He was in full dress uniform, every decoration in its precise position, every element of his appearance carrying the weight of deliberate formality. He looked, in that moment, exactly like what he was, one of the most decorated combat commanders in the United States military, a man whose career represented the absolute upper register of what the profession could produce. The assembled soldiers straightened instinctively. Colonel Marsh, standing to the left of the platform, had an expression of carefully maintained composure that suggested he knew something the formation did not. Whitmore adjusted the microphone, looked out across the assembled ranks with the measured calm of a man entirely in command of the space he occupied. Then he began to speak. His opening was formal acknowledgement of the base command, recognition of the unit's operational performance during the assessment period, the standard architecture of an address delivered by a visiting senior officer. His voice carried across the formation ground with the natural authority of a man who had never needed amplification to fill a room. Soldiers listened with the polite, half-present attention that mandatory formations typically generated. Then mid-sentence he stopped. The silence was so sudden and so complete that several soldiers in the front row visibly startled. Whitmore stood at the microphone for exactly 3 seconds, not hesitating, not searching for words, but pausing with the deliberate precision of a man who had decided that what came next required a different kind of space than the one he had been occupying. He stepped back from the microphone. He descended the platform steps with the unhurried certainty of a man who knew exactly where he was going and had decided that the distance between where he stood and where he needed to be was a distance worth crossing in front of everyone. He walked into the formation. The ranks held their collective breath. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the measured strike of Whitmore's boots on the gravel, each step precise and deliberate, moving through the parted space between soldiers with a directness that made the destination feel inevitable even before anyone understood what the destination was. He stopped in front of Corporal Daniel Hess. The third row, fourth from the left. The quiet man who had arrived 10 minutes early and expected nothing, and was now standing at rigid attention, while a four-star general stood directly before him, and the entire assembled population of Fob Greystone collectively stopped breathing. Daniel's eyes remained forward. His jaw was set. His expression was the expression of a man exercising considerable internal discipline over a considerable internal response, not performing composure, but genuinely reaching for it with both hands. Whitmore reached into his jacket. He produced a single folded sheet of paper, not a prop, not a ceremonial document printed for the occasion, but a piece of paper that had clearly been written on, folded carefully and carried in a jacket pocket where it had been accessible at any moment. He unfolded it with both hands, looked at it briefly, then looked up at Daniel, and began to read. He read from memory, using the paper only as confirmation, his eyes moving between the document and Daniel's face, with the attention of a man who needed the person he was addressing to understand that these words had been chosen with complete deliberateness. He described October 14th in full, the collapse, the darkness, the dead radio, the 4 extractions. He named Specialist Carver. He named Private Domings. He named Sergeant Torres. He described the conditions, the rubble, the headlamp, the singular trauma kit stretched across 4 separate emergencies across an entire night. And then he said Marcus Webb's name. He said it the way it deserved to be said, clearly, without rushing past it, giving it the full weight of its 19 years. He described the photograph, the dog named Biscuit, the summer grass, the particular devastating detail of Daniel placing the photograph back in the breast pocket exactly where it had been, in the dark, in the rubble, before standing up and walking home. He described Daniel returning to duty the next morning. He described the incomplete forms, the missing reports, the silence that had surrounded a story that should never have been allowed to remain untold. His voice did not waver once. When he finished reading, he refolded the paper with the same care with which he had unfolded it and returned it to his jacket pocket. Then he reached in again, deeper this time, into the interior, and produced a commendation medal in its formal presentation case. He opened the case, removed the medal, and with the precise, unhurried movements of a man performing an act he considered genuinely important, he pinned it directly onto Daniel's chest. The formation watched in absolute silence. Daniel stood rigid, back straight, chin level, eyes burning with something that was working very hard not to become something else. His jaw was locked so tight that the muscle along it was visibly defined. He breathed slowly, steadily, with the controlled discipline of a man who had decided, somewhere in the last 30 seconds, that he was going to hold himself together through this moment if it was the last coherent thing he ever did. At his left heel, Rex sat. Nobody had commanded him there. Ortega was standing 50 feet away in the handler's position and had not given a single signal. Rex had simply moved, quietly, purposefully, through the gap in the formation, and positioned himself at Daniel's left side with his chest forward and his ears up and his entire bearing carrying the specific, unambiguous quality of an animal that understood, on whatever level animals understood things, that this moment was significant. That the man beside him was significant. That staying close was the correct and only response to what was happening. Whitmore stepped back. He looked at Daniel for a long moment, not with the evaluating gaze of a commander assessing a subordinate, but with something quieter and more personal than that. The look of a man who had spent the last 7 days understanding something he wished he had understood sooner. Then he raised his right hand and rendered a salute, sharp, formal, complete, to a corporal. The formation held for one stunned second. Then, beginning from the front row and moving backward through the ranks like a wave that had been building since October 14th and had simply been waiting for this exact moment to break, every soldier on Fob Greystone raised their hand and saluted Corporal Daniel Hess. Rex sat perfectly still at his left heel. And in the pale morning light of the formation ground, the quiet man in the corner, the invisible medic who had carried everything alone and asked for nothing and believed, in the honest and devastating way of people who give without accounting, that his story was not worth the paperwork, stood inside the acknowledgement he had never sought, and held himself together. Barely. Beautifully. The transport was scheduled for 600. Fob Greystone did not make ceremony of departures, not typically, not for visiting delegations, not even for senior officers whose presence had reshaped the operational tempo of the base in ways that would take weeks to fully measure. Departures were logistical events, vehicle to airstrip, airstrip to aircraft, aircraft to wherever the military needed you next. The base absorbed arrivals and released departures with the same practiced indifference, because attachment was a luxury that forward operating bases could not structurally afford. But on the morning of General Whitmore's departure, something quietly different happened. They came without being told to. Not in formation, not in uniform dress, just soldiers, individually, in pairs, in small clusters, drifting toward the eastern gate in the gray pre-dawn light with the unhurried, purposeful movement of people who had somewhere they needed to be without being able to fully articulate why. Sergeant Briggs was there, hands in his jacket, standing to the side with the stillness of a man paying a debt he hadn't known he owed. Ortega stood near the K-9 transport vehicle, one hand resting on the door, watching. Even Lieutenant Farris was there, standing farther back than everyone else, quieter than he had perhaps ever been, wearing the particular expression of a young officer in the early stages of learning something important about the difference between rank and worth. Daniel stood at the gate. He had arrived at 5:45 early, as always, for reasons he didn't examine. He stood with his hands loose at his sides, and his face carrying the specific, settled quality of a man who had passed through something significant and come out the other side not unchanged, but no longer entirely alone inside the change. The commendation was not on his uniform this morning. It was in his quarters on the small shelf above his bunk, placed there the previous evening with the same careful deliberateness with which he did everything. He knew it was there. That was enough. Whitmore emerged from the command building at 5:58. He moved through the gathered soldiers with acknowledgments, nods, brief words, the practiced efficiency of a man managing a departure on a timeline. He shook Colonel Marsh's hand, exchanged a final word with his aide, and then he walked to the gate where Daniel stood, and the two men faced each other in the gray morning light with the particular quality of people who have said the important things already and are now simply in the presence of the ending. Whitmore extended his hand. Daniel took it. The handshake was firm and brief and carried, in its pressure and duration, everything that neither man was going to say out loud, which was considerable. "You have my direct line," Whitmore said. "Use it." Daniel nodded once. "Thank you, sir," a pause, "for the paperwork." Something moved in Whitmore's expression, not quite a smile, but the territory immediately adjacent to one. "It was 18 months overdue," he said simply. He held Daniel's gaze for one final moment. Then he turned and walked toward the transport vehicle where his aide was waiting with the door open and his kit already loaded. He moved with the same measured certainty he brought to everything. A man entirely at home, inside forward motion, inside the constant departure that military life required of its people. Rex was already at the vehicle. Ortega had him on lead, the formal working lead, not the training line, the one that meant operational movement. Rex walked cooperatively, professionally, with the disciplined composure of a military working dog transitioning between assignments. He reached the loading ramp, placed his front paws on it, began to ascend, and stopped. He stopped at the top of the ramp and turned his head, not toward Whitmore, not toward Ortega, not toward any of the gathered soldiers whose faces were tilted toward him with expressions of collective, held-breath attention. He turned his head toward the gate, toward the specific point in the gray morning where Daniel Hess was standing with his hands at his sides and his face carrying its characteristic stillness. Rex held it for 3 seconds. 3 full, complete, unhurried seconds, the gaze of an animal communicating something that existed entirely outside the architecture of language but was nonetheless entirely clear to everyone watching. It was not goodbye exactly. It was something more permanent than that. Something closer to, I found you. I will not forget where you are. Then he turned and walked up the ramp and into the transport and was gone. The vehicle moved. The gate closed. The gathered soldiers began to disperse in ones and twos, drifting back toward the business of the day with the quiet, slightly altered quality of people who had witnessed something they would be thinking about for a long time without necessarily being able to explain what it was. Daniel stood at the gate until the vehicle was out of sight. Then he turned and walked to the mess hall. He arrived at his corner at 6:23, later than usual, which was itself unusual enough that the soldier running the coffee station noticed, and then immediately felt strange about noticing. Daniel collected his tray. Black coffee, eggs, toast, the same breakfast that had accompanied every morning of the past 11 months, assembled with the same unhurried efficiency, carried to the same corner table with the same quiet purposefulness. He sat down. He looked at the wall. The familiar wall, the familiar grain, the familiar silence of the eastern corner that had been his alone for so long that it had begun to feel less like a choice and more like a condition of his existence. He picked up his fork. Boots scuffed nearby. He didn't look up immediately, not because he was ignoring the sound, but because he had learned, across 11 months of solitary breakfasts, that sounds near his table were almost always incidental. Passing traffic, rearranged chairs, the ordinary movement of people going somewhere other than here. But the boots stopped. He looked up. A young private stood at the edge of his table, 18 years old at most, brand new in the way that was visible in every detail of his bearing. From the overpressed uniform to the careful way, he was holding his tray like it might escape. He had the look of someone who had made a decision and was now living in the precise, terrifying moment between commitment and execution. "Can I sit here, Corporal?" The mess hall, in the particular way of spaces where people were pretending not to pay attention while paying complete attention, went fractionally quieter. Daniel looked at the private for a moment, really looked, with the full, unhurried attention that he rarely directed outward, taking in the nervousness and the deliberateness and the courage that it actually took, at 18, in a military mess hall, to walk to the corner table of a decorated corporal and ask that question. Something moved across Daniel's face. Not a performance, not the careful management of expression that he had practiced for 11 months as a form of self-preservation. Something genuine and unguarded and completely unannounced, the specific expression of a man who has been carrying something alone for so long that the offer of company arrives not as comfort, but as revelation, like a window opened in a room that had forgotten it was sealed. He nodded. The private sat. He arranged his tray with the nervous efficiency of someone trying very hard to appear less nervous than he was, and opened his mouth to say something, and then thought better of it, and then thought better of thinking better of it. "I was at the formation yesterday, Corporal," he said quietly. "What the general said about the building and the soldiers, and—" He stopped, steadied himself. "I just wanted to sit here, if that's okay." Daniel looked at him for a moment, then back at his coffee. "It's okay," he said. A sergeant sat down 2 minutes later. Then a female specialist who had eaten alone by the window for 3 months and had watched the formation from the back row with her jaw clenched and her eyes bright. Then two more soldiers, and another, each one arriving with the quiet deliberateness of people who had made an individual decision that happened to be the same decision, moving toward the eastern corner like something that had always been moving that way and had simply needed permission. The corner filled. Not with noise, not with the loud, performative camaraderie of people demonstrating their own sociability, with the specific, comfortable warmth of people who had all, in their own private ways, been sitting alone somewhere, and had decided this morning to stop. Daniel ate his eggs. He listened to the conversation that built gradually around him, careful at first, then easier, then simply present, and he did not perform happiness because he had never performed anything. But somewhere in the architecture of his stillness, something had shifted, some weight redistributed, some long-held tension in the structure of him finding, very quietly, a new arrangement. That evening, the base psychiatrist updated her private log for the final time. She wrote without rushing, in the careful, considered language of someone who understood that some observations only became visible over time and deserved to be recorded with the precision they had earned. Corporal Hess no longer carries it alone. The silence that surrounded him was never permanent. It was simply waiting for the right person to walk through it first. Sometimes it takes a general and a dog to remind a man that his story was always worth telling. And sometimes, once one person sits down, everyone else remembers that they were always allowed to. She closed the log. Across the Atlantic, at 37,000 feet, in the cabin of a military transport aircraft, General Cole Whitmore sat with his jacket folded across his lap, and his eyes closed, and the folded piece of paper, the one he had read aloud at formation, the one that had taken him 48 hours and every ounce of his considerable institutional authority to push through channels resting in his breast pocket against his chest. His breathing slowed. His hands, resting open on his knees, gradually released the tension they had carried for 7 years. And for the first time since a coastal extraction mission on a night that had no right to be as quiet as it was, for the first time since 6 men went in and 1 came out, and the medals came, and the speeches came, and the silence came and stayed and stayed and stayed, General Cole Whitmore closed his eyes at 37,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean. And slept, without dreaming of the dead. And